Hi everyone, my name is Ben Rogers. I work for Paradigm Trust. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Pedagogy. One of my roles has been to work with colleagues to develop our science curriculum, our primary and then through to secondary science curriculum over the past 3 years. And it's been we've spent a lot of time looking at what the evidence says and building up our curriculum from there. And so I wanted to share that with you. And I want to share with you three big levers that we use for justifying the amount of curriculum time that we give to science. And the three levers I've got are the science foundations. So the idea that learning science at year one, year two, early years really helps those children make faster progress and more successful learning later on in their science career, all the way through up to GCSE and beyond. And that's what my little logo here represents, my little building blocks. So question one, does learning science primary impact on secondary performance and secondary learning? The answer is it seems that it does. My little logo down here, my little time bomb, is the opposite. If you don't teach science effectively at Key Stage 1, early years, Key Stage 2, the number of misconceptions builds much more rapidly and are much more persistent. And so in order to avoid those misconceptions, you need a science curriculum that's well developed and built on solid foundations. So 2 reasons for teaching science to primary school children in order to benefit the secondary colleagues. That might not feel appealing to you, but hopefully the next one does, which is cultural capital. Cultural capital is the idea that knowing more about the world and knowing more about science helps you engage with the world more effectively. So my top little logo here is a book. Having knowledge about science will enable you to read more effectively, especially if that text contains any science, any reference to anything scientific. And we'll have a look at that Dodo text, that famous 2016 SATS paper full of science and full of scientific terminology that threw some kids and not others, depending partly on their science capital, their cultural capital. And my little globe down here at the bottom is all about understanding the world. Why would we want to withhold that from children when they need to be understanding how the environment works, how decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis, we shouldn't be excluding them from that. And so I'll talk to you about that shortly. So that's my cultural capital lever. And the final lever I wanted to talk about today that I'm going to pull is called science capital. Well, science capital is slightly different in that it's the capital. It's the children who have a higher science capital are able to then go and make progress in their careers using that science. So whether that's directly as a scientist or in any field that relates to science, the children who have a higher science capital feel able to make they make faster progress, but they also feel able to make decisions and doors that are open to them that wouldn't be open before. And my last little part of science capital down at the bottom, last but no way least, is I've got a little equal sign for equality. There are different groups of your learners who are able to access their science capital differently. So whether it's young black kids who do never see an example of a black scientist, or whether it's poor working class boys or other groups who are failing to be able to make use of their science capital. We'll talk about that as well. So those are my 3 levers. I hope I've drawn you in. I hope there's something in here for you. I'll start with the science foundations, and I'll start with this idea that building early blocks of knowledge and solid understanding enables you to go higher and faster throughout your science school career. And there is research for this, so I'm not just giving you my opinion. The challenge here is that you do the research, you have to track those same children for quite a long time, and that's expensive and it's difficult, and getting researchers to commit to that length of time is challenging. We're talking about getting children from tracking children, giving them an intervention in year 1 and 2, say, and then following all the way through to GCSE. You can see how many years that is. Now, it has been done a number of times, and it continues to be done. There are longitudinal studies being done in Sweden and in Switzerland as we speak. There are also some older ones worth looking at as well. And I've got one that's actually from the 70s and 80s, an American study by a researcher called Novak. And I will show you if I can. Why can't I? Here we go. So here we are, a little boy in the 70s, could be me, it's not me. It's an American study, so I've got here grade 1, grade 3, grade 7, but I've put the English years above so you can see where we are. And what happened was a series of, this is believe it or not, a tape recorder, and you can see the earphones. There were stations put around the room, 24 of them, and over a 2-year period, the children were tracked to take part in all of those interventions. It was basically an audio lesson and with a thing to interact with, short intervention. And it took place from year 2 to year 4. And what we're interested in is to see, is there impact over this period all the way up to year 11, 12, and 13? And the answer is, or was, yes, and quite a substantial impact as well. So they've measured the number of valid notions. You can look at this paper. It's actually, there's a PDF of the whole book online I can share with you. The black box here is the children who've had the intervention, so the children who underwent these 24 interventions here. And you can see, starts off with them knowing more. You'd expect that. These children, it's not that they didn't have science lessons, it's just that they didn't have those interventions. So these interventions not only have an impact at the time, but if you look down here, year 8, you can see incredibly that gap is still there. And in fact, the gap's getting bigger, even though the interventions finished however many years ago. 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. You can see here the gap is really significant. It was a large study as well. So I think there is definitely evidence, and other studies back this up, that if you give kids a good foundation in the science and their understanding, the impact can be felt many years in the future. And our secondary colleagues will be very grateful and take all the credit. But it will be down to Key Stage 1 and early years teachers that some of that, a substantial part of that impact. So well done us. That research is by Novak, and the book was published in 2005. The next bit, and I'm using the same study, though again, there is evidence that suggests that children who do not study science in a rigorous way through their primary school curriculum, the number of misconceptions really ramps up. Whereas those who have a more structured science curriculum from early on in their primary career will go on to have fewer misconceptions, and quite possibly that's one of the reasons they make greater progress later on. So let's have a look at the same study. And again, the black box is the children who went through those 24 interventions, and you can see substantially fewer misconceptions. And those misconceptions continue to decrease because of those solid foundations, all the way up through to year 12, which is grade 12, which is year 13. So you can see how long this study took to carry out. But what's interesting is the children who hadn't had that intervention, the number of misconceptions doesn't really go down. They're pretty much static. And there's plenty of evidence from elsewhere that suggests that those misconceptions don't go away. Sometimes in year 12 and 13 and even onto university, studies have shown that those misconceptions are there waiting to come out and bite people under stressful circumstances. So if you have an undergraduate who can give you the correct answer and perform well in assessments, if you put them in a challenging situation, maybe problem solving, those misconceptions leap straight back out. So again, studying science with a structured curriculum from Key Stage 1 onwards, early years onwards, has a long impact into the future for those kids. So I hope I've convinced everybody that if we don't teach science to our younger children, there will be negative consequences on their later performance and their later understanding. Great. So, next slide. I'm going to talk about cultural capital and that idea that children or young children need to understand, have some scientific knowledge in order to understand books, in order to understand the news, in order to understand conversations, and to engage with the world around them. Now, this kind of knowledge doesn't actually have to be quite as deep as the knowledge that we were looking at in the Science Foundation. So if you were talking about forces for cultural capital, you'll know adults who don't have a particularly deep understanding of forces. That's not a problem. They have some understanding of forces, and they'll know what you're talking about if you're talking about balanced forces and so on. But they won't necessarily be able to resolve forces at different angles. That's okay. The cultural capital, the metaphor is it's like a sheet of ice. It's not necessarily very thick, but very wide. So let's have a look at some examples of that. And I took that Dodo text. If you were teaching in 2016 in year 6, this will haunt you. So that text is full of knowledge about evolution. It doesn't mention Darwin, but it talks about extinction. It talks about the skeleton and what we can learn from the skeleton, and talks about evidence. It talks about volcanoes and undersea volcanoes, and there's that phrase, Mauritius was spat out of the ocean floor. That children without that understanding of what a volcano and what an eruption looks like and haven't studied that is really going to find that text less comprehensible, less penetrable, and able to make less effective inferences from that. So I'd argue very strongly that a scientific knowledge, a broad and not necessarily very deep, but a broad understanding of the world around them is vital for them to understand texts on and news articles and the world around them, and for them to engage with that. And we shouldn't be withholding that from them at any age. As soon as they're capable of understanding about ecosystems, they should be understanding that about microplastics, about space, about the world around them. They should be learning that. And here's my little visual for all of the things that they might be seeing in the news and trying to understand and make sense of, or not even in the news, in the world around them. Okay, we shouldn't be hiding this knowledge from children. And then on to the final section, which for me is equally important. My final lever to pull is this science capital. And again, you could argue that if children are able to make good progress at secondary school, then science capital is not so important at primary school. However, there have been longitudinal studies that look at when children start making decisions about the kind of career they want to have and what they see as important. And it turns out it doesn't change very much from primary school. So this is from a piece of research called Aspires, a longitudinal study. These longitudinal studies tend to release their data bit by bit because they take so long. This one was from Aspires 2, and Aspires 3 is underway. Those children are now getting older and older. So the different colour bars, if we look over here, these are the primary school kids. So these primary school kids, their opinion of science is about as high as it gets. This is A-level. So you'd expect the kids taking A-level to have a higher spike there, I should think. Parents think that science is important at peaks at GCSE. Interesting that the parents are not so bothered at A-level, but maybe it's too late for those children. I won't worry about them. I'll worry about the primary school children. Think that scientists do valuable work. We're sort of hovering around the 80%. So you would think that a number of children would be interested in science as a career because it's interesting and it's important and it's valuable. Yet it really isn't very high, sort of 10-15% of primary and drops. The evidence suggests that children have already made their mind up largely by the time they leave primary school whether they're interested in science as a career. And that's interesting, perhaps bad, I don't know, but certainly relevant to us. What's equally relevant and more disturbing is that percentage isn't consistent across different ethnic groups and different cultural groups. So if you look at black boys or black girls, it will be lower. If you look at poor working class white boys, it will be lower. If you look at other groups, it'll be higher. Now, that's if those children don't feel that that door is open to them for whatever reason, then I think that's a serious issue. So I think part of our role as primary teachers and primary science teachers is to make sure that children from all different groups and backgrounds can see themselves represented in the world of science, in the images we use, in the examples we use, and not constantly pictures of white men in beards, white men in white coats, bearded white men in, anyway, people like me. We don't want to be seeing that. Thank you very much. Young science graduates, researchers, young black people, young men, young women, so that children can say, actually, science is important, science is relevant, science is valuable, I like science, why don't I do that for the rest of my life? Let them think that early on, and the evidence suggests that they'll carry on thinking it throughout their school careers, and then make choices, and hopefully more informed choices. So they're not subliminally thinking, yeah, I like science, but we don't have people like me in science. Okay, and that's it from me. Science at primary school is really very important. No, there's no getting away from it. Children suffer if they don't have a good science education, a good science curriculum at primary. It needs to be planned through. There are some areas where it needs to be deep in terms of a deep study to prevent misconceptions and to build upon later on. Some understanding doesn't need to be as deep, but needs to be broad. So if you're thinking about engagement with the world, when you're doing microplastics, you don't need to spend forever on the structure of plastics. What you do need to spend a bit of time on is covering the implications and how that fits in with the world around us. And then that final lever, that science capital, kids think science is important. Kids like science from a young age, but kids don't always choose science. And part of that is likely because they don't see themselves as that group of people having careers in science. So that's up to us to ensure that we deliver on all three of those, pull all three of those levers, with our classrooms. All right. Thank you very much. I hope that's useful. Take care, and please email me or send me messages on Twitter if there's anything you want to discuss. I like talking primary science. Take care.